Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. I recently received this care package from my friends at warscenery.com. We decided to team up for a video to see if I can make something pretty cool looking with some of their Star Wars inspired terrain. So, let's see what we can do. But first of all, a huge thank you to the guys at War Scenery for sending along some of their pieces for me to have a play with. They have a huge range of 3D printable terrain spanning from Warhammer 40k to Star Wars Legion and a few bits in between. Like these really cool looking pre-supported minis that are ready to print. So if you like the look of these designs, you can check out what else they've got on offer at warscenery.com. And they've sent me some pre-printed buildings and a few pieces of scatter terrain from their Outer Rim pack. And after having a little bit of time to check out these pieces, I had a little think about what I was going to make. And I eventually decided it might be a pretty cool idea to try and recreate that harrowing scene from the Kenobi series. Say what you will about the show itself, you got to admit, this scene pretty much single-handedly managed to scare the shit out of anybody who watched it. And for good reason. And with that decision made, it was then time to go ahead and prep the prints. While these FDM prints are really tough and durable, they do still have a few print lines in, but we can fix that with some filler primer. It was just a case of taking all the pieces outside and giving them a couple of coats of primer with some sanding in between.
I don't like sand.
And while this did get rid of most of the print lines, I decided to take it one step further and give everything an extra layer of texture with some matte Mod Podge. And all I did for this step was apply a good amount of Mod Podge across the surface of all the pieces, and then I could come in with a sponge and apply the texture that I was after. I was just sort of aiming for something between stone and concrete. Then it was onto a final layer of primer from Vallejo, just to make sure everything was sealed in correctly and give me a nice dark colour to work from. Then I could start to build up the rest of the colours, starting with a mahogany undercoat just to give everything a little more warmth. Then I applied a base coat with a medium grey, concentrating on the middle of most of the panels and trying to leave some of the mahogany showing through around the recesses. And I followed that up with a final layer of stone golem from the army painter, concentrating mainly on adding some highlights to each individual panel. And once I was happy, I could switch from the airbrush to a normal brush and start to fill in all of the metal details with some gunmetal from Vallejo. And after very carefully painting in the signs with some fire giant orange speed paint from the army painter, I was ready to start weathering. But to get all my enamel washes to flow nicely, I first needed to take everything outside and give it all a coat with some gloss varnish. Then I could move on to giving everything a coat with some of AK's Starship Streaking Grime. And I made sure to apply a pretty disrespectful amount of wash.
This is outrageous.
This is just to ensure that I definitely get the look that I'm after when it comes to removing the excess with some paper towel. And I'll admit, this probably isn't the most cost effective way of using this wash, but I was pretty happy with the results, so for me, it was worth it.
Another happy landing.
Then it was on to applying a few other enamel products onto the more specific details. All of the metal details received a light rust wash from MIG, and I also applied some oil streaks with one of their streaking brushes. And after applying a few more rusty details with some pigment powders, I could then move on to trying a new product that I've been wanting to try out for a little while. And that's these liquid pigments from Life Colour.
What?
And I know that sounds a little strange, but essentially these liquid pigments give you the same result as a normal pigment powder, but with the benefit of being able to apply them through an airbrush. Which means we can do things like add dusty, sandy areas around the bottom of the building and across a few of the walkways, and even a few more streaking effects on some of the other scatter terrain. And just like with normal pigment powders, when that's all dry, we just need to make sure we seal it all in with some matte varnish. And finally, to finish these buildings off, I'm going to add a few LEDs. The scene in the show takes place at night time on Mapuzo, and all the lights in the background do help to create that spooky atmosphere, so I'm going to try my best to try and recreate it by adding a handful of LEDs to each building. And I decided to go for a warm yellow colour, just like in the show. And when they'd all been glued in the correct positions, it was time to put the buildings to one side and concentrate on the base. And I decided to make the base off camera this time because it wasn't anything particularly fancy. I just stuck some polystyrene on top of an old canvas frame and then used some mountain card along the sides, just like the rest of my builds. And because I'm going to eventually end up covering this in plaster, I needed to make sure it was definitely going to stick to this foam because the foam is quite soft. So a layer of black gesso primer should help all of the plaster bite to the foam. And when it comes to the plaster mix, I also decided to add a good amount of matte Mod Podge. Hopefully this is going to give the plaster a little more durability when it's all dried through. And once that was thoroughly mixed, it was time to get messy. And after a few hours of drying time, I could then lay all the pieces out on the base and start to get a look and a feel for the scene. Along with also deciding where I was going to add in the extra details, starting with some scrap pieces of wire. I used a Sharpie to lay down a rough guide and give me a bit of a better idea of where I needed to stick down the wires. And at this point, I wasn't entirely sure if this was going to be worth doing or how it would turn out. But one thing I do tend to notice in a lot of these Star Wars environments, they have cables and wires just running across the floor. So, at the very least, it might make for a little bit more visual interest. And for the next set of extra details, I also added a couple of these 3D printed junk piles. And as always, if you're interested in checking out any of the STLs I've used for this build, I'll be sure to pop a link down for them all in the description. And with that, we were just about ready to start applying some texture to the groundwork. And I went with my go-to dark earth texture paste from AK. And after giving the whole surface a good even covering with the paste, I added a little bit of tile grout just for some variation in the texture. This then all got sealed in with some watered down PVA glue. And while I was waiting for all of that to dry through, I took the chance to tidy the sides up with some black gesso. And then all the groundwork was ready for paint, and in a very similar style to the buildings, I started by giving everything a good even coat with a dark brown colour. This left me with a nice uniform base that we could then start applying some more colours on top of, starting with some brown sand from Vallejo.
I don't like sand.
Followed by a highlighting layer with some of Vallejo's Iraqi sand. Then I applied these same steps to the wires and the junk piles. Just a base coat, followed by a medium tone, then some highlights, and to pull out the details, a few washes. And I also used a couple of different enamel washes across all of the sand. And I find this works best for me if I just apply a few dabs of each colour in a small area at a time, and then introduce some enamel thinner. And once that's all been blended together and made some variation, you're left with a really nice natural look. And that meant I was now at a point where I could thread all the wires through and finally get the buildings locked into place. And once I had my toggle switch fitted into place and the battery pack, I could finish up by soldering the circuit together. And that was pretty much the base finished. But I still kind of felt that the buildings were lacking something, and they did actually come with these canopies that you fit across the windows. And to be honest, I wasn't 100% convinced that they were going to look good, so I decided to modify them a little bit. And I started by giving them all a very similar paint job to the rest of the metal details. And then, with my daughter's permission, I borrowed some of her baby wipes.
What?
No, I haven't quite gone crazy yet. But I've known about this technique for a little while, but never really had the chance to use it, so let's see what we can do with it. Basically, I'm going to use these baby wipes to create a scale version of some canvas. And it's actually really easy to do. We just take some watered down PVA glue and add an appropriately coloured pigment powder. Then we can take pieces of the baby wipe and soak it through. And the baby wipes are ideal for this because they don't dissolve, unlike something like a paper towel. And then it's just a case of laying the baby wipe on top of the window covers and moulding it into the correct shape. And once they'd all had some time to dry, we were left with a fairly convincing look. And because they turned out better than I thought they would, I also decided to make a few extra canopies, using the baby wipes in the same way and just laying them over a frame that I'd made with some styrene tubes. And then I connected some scrap wires between the antennas just for a few finishing touches. And this time, that really was the base finished, which meant I could then move on to the next job on my list, which was the inhabitants. And to create the unfortunate father and son victims of Vader, I needed to head over to Hero Forge. And using their really handy creator tool, I could design and pose each of the characters individually. Which is awesome because without it, I probably couldn't have finished this build off properly. All of the creator tools they have are really easy to use, and once you've purchased the STL, it's just a case of printing them out. So, big shout out to Hero Forge. Keep up the good work. But as well as the unfortunate victims, I needed Vader himself, and I decided to go with this design from Skullforge Studios. Along with a whole load of backup. And I even decided to print a little gonk droid, just for a bit of background scenery. And if you notice in the actual scene, Vader doesn't have his lightsaber ignited, so it had to go. Sorry, big guy. Then it's just a case of getting everybody primed before I could start painting. And like I've mentioned before, miniature painting isn't my strong suit, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. But with Vader, I started off with a somewhat dark grey base coat, and then went on with a lighter grey dry brush to pull out all of the details and create a little more texture. And after blocking out the pieces of his armour with the original grey base coat, I could then give everything a wash with some dark tone from the army painter, just to create some more shadows in all of those recesses. Then it was on to blocking out all of the other details like his belt buckle, lightsaber hilt and the buttons of his chest. And once I'd added a layer of matte varnish to his cape and his undersuit, that was Vader pretty much finished. And all of the stormtroopers received an even simpler paint job. I started by giving them all a pretty heavy zenithal highlight with the airbrush. Then a quick dry brush with some pure white to highlight all of the details, followed by a watered down black wash to create some shadows, and finally finishing off with some of that sandy coloured liquid pigment around the legs and feet to blend them into the groundwork. And then I followed these same steps for both of Vader's victims, and of course not forgetting our little gonk droid. And then once I'd fitted some acrylic rod to Mr. Force Choke, I could then finally start placing everybody on the base. And finally, with the addition of some of War Scenery's crates, I think we were just about ready for some glamour shots. So that's just about going to do it for this video, and as always, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.